When did ancient humans first get drunk by accident? You're crouched at the edge of a forest. It's 20,000 BC. You haven't eaten since yesterday, your feet hurt, and the tree you've been eyeing all week has finally dropped its fruit. But the fruit on the ground isn't fresh. It's soft. It's split open. It smells sharp, a little rotten, a little sweet, and honestly kind of amazing. You're starving, so you don't think twice. You grab a handful and eat. And about 20 minutes later, something very strange starts happening inside your skull. The forest feels a little warmer. Your shoulders drop. That gnawing fear that never fully leaves a prehistoric brain goes quiet for the first time in days. You feel, and there's no word for this yet, good. You have no idea what just happened to you. But your descendants will build entire civilizations around chasing that exact feeling. This is the story of the first time a human ever got drunk. Not the first brewery, not the first tavern, not your uncle at a wedding. We're talking about the very first time a human being felt the effects of alcohol and had absolutely no framework to understand what was going on. And here's the part that should genuinely mess with you a little. It might have happened before we were even fully human. The answer to when humans first got drunk isn't written in a history book. It's written in your DNA. Let's start with the fruit, because before there were bars, before there was beer, before there was agriculture or writing or any of it, there was fermented fruit rotting on a forest floor. And to understand why that matters, you need to understand what fermentation actually is. When fruit ripens, it fills with sugar. When it falls and starts to break down, wild yeast, which is floating around in the air constantly, lands on it and starts eating that sugar. And when yeast eats sugar, it produces two things: carbon dioxide and ethanol. Ethanol is alcohol. That's it. That's the whole trick. Alcohol is not a human invention. It's not even close. Alcohol is what happens automatically when sugar and yeast and thyme get in a room together. It has been happening on this planet for tens of millions of years, long before anything resembling a human was around to enjoy it. Which means the very first creatures to get drunk were not people. They were animals. And they were doing it completely by accident, over and over, for millions of years. Now here's where it gets interesting, because there's a theory about this, and it has one of the best names in all of science. It's called the drunken monkey hypothesis. The idea, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley, goes like this. Our distant primate ancestors lived in trees and ate a lot of fruit. Ripe fruit is high in calories, which is exactly what you want when you're a small primate trying not to die. But ripe fruit gives off a very specific smell as it ferments, that sharp, boozy, sweet scent. And a primate who could smell that scent from far away and follow it to the food had a real survival advantage. So evolution may have quietly wired us to be attracted to the smell of alcohol, not because alcohol was the point, but because it was a signal. The smell of fermentation meant sugar, meant calories, meant survival. In other words, the reason a glass of wine smells appealing to you today might be because 40 million years ago, that exact smell led your ancestors to dinner. But it goes deeper than a smell. It goes all the way down to the machinery inside your cells. Around 10 million years ago, one of our ancestors, a common ancestor of humans, chimps, and gorillas, developed a mutation in a gene called ADH4. This gene makes an enzyme that breaks down alcohol in your body. And this specific mutation made that enzyme roughly 40 times more efficient at metabolizing ethanol. Think about what that means, 40 times better. That is not a small tweak. That is evolution spending real resources to build a better alcohol processing system. And evolution does not do that for fun. It does that when something matters for survival. The most likely reason? Our ancestors were coming down from the trees, spending more time on the ground, and eating fruit that had fallen and started to ferment. The ones who could eat that slightly boozy fruit without getting sick, without getting so impaired they became lunch, those individuals survived. The ones who couldn't process it didn't. So you, right now, have a body that is specifically, genetically engineered by 10 million years of evolution to handle alcohol. You are, quite literally, built to drink, which is either reassuring or deeply concerning depending on how your weekend went. Let's talk about the animals because this is where the story gets genuinely ridiculous and honestly, a little bit comforting. Humans are not the only creatures that get drunk. Not by a long shot. There's a small primate in Malaysia called the pen-tailed tree shrew that drinks fermented palm nectar basically every single night. This nectar can reach an alcohol content comparable to a light beer, and the tree shrew consumes the human equivalent of about 9 drinks a night, every night, and shows almost no signs of being impaired. This tiny animal has been on a nightly bender for millions of years and it's completely fine. Nature's designated survivor. Then there are elephants, who have a long-running reputation for getting drunk off fermented marula fruit, staggering around the savannah afterward. Now, to be fair, scientists have argued about whether elephants can actually eat enough fermented marula to get properly drunk, given their enormous size. But the fact that the legend has survived for centuries, passed down by people who lived alongside these animals, tells you something. People watched large animals behave strangely near rotting fruit and came to a very reasonable conclusion. There are birds that eat fermented berries and quite literally fly into windows because they're too intoxicated to navigate. In some cold snaps, entire flocks of waxwings have been found grounded, sleeping it off, because the berries froze and fermented and the birds ate them anyway. Some places have even reported picking up dazed, hungover birds and putting them in boxes to sober up before releasing them, which is, when you think about it, a tiny avian drunk tank. There are bats that have been tested for alcohol tolerance, and some species can fly through an obstacle course with a blood alcohol level that would get a human arrested, no problem. They eat fermenting fruit constantly and have simply evolved to deal with it, echolocating perfectly while completely soused. There's even evidence of bees getting drunk on fermented nectar, and here's the dark part. They get kicked out of the hive for it. Drunk bees are turned away at the door by sober guard bees. There is a bouncer situation happening in beehives. The point of all this isn't just that it's funny, although it absolutely is. The point is that intoxication is not some weird human quirk. The desire, or at least the accidental habit of consuming alcohol, is woven through the entire animal kingdom. We didn't invent getting drunk. We inherited it. We just did what humans always do. We took something that already existed and became absolutely obsessed with it. So when did it stop being an accident? When did a human stop stumbling onto fermented fruit and start making the fermented stuff on purpose? Because that's the real turning point. That's the moment alcohol goes from a random gift of the forest to a technology. And the archaeology here is genuinely stunning. The oldest chemical evidence we have of an intentionally fermented beverage comes from a site in China called Jiahu, dating back around 9,000 years. Researchers analyzed the residue inside ancient pottery and found the signature of a fermented drink made from rice, honey, and fruit. 9,000 years ago, someone was deliberately brewing, and this wasn't a one-off accident that someone stumbled into and forgot. To leave a residue that survives 9,000 years and shows up consistently in multiple vessels, this had to be a repeated, understood, intentional process. Someone knew what they were doing. Someone had figured out the recipe, taught it to others, and done it again and again. Which means the knowledge of how to make alcohol on purpose is at least that old, and the accidental discovery that inspired it has to be older still, stretching back into a past we can only guess at, because the fruit and the wooden bowls and the first curious brewers all dissolved back into the earth long ago. But the story might go back even further, and it might be tangled up with the single most important event in human history. Here's the reversal that reshapes everything. For a long time, the standard story was simple. Humans invented agriculture, we started farming grain, we had extra grain lying around, and eventually someone figured out you could ferment it into beer. Beer was a happy accident that came after farming. Bread first, beer second. But some researchers have proposed something that flips that entirely. What if it was the other way around? What if we didn't start farming to make bread? What if we started farming to make beer? This is sometimes called the beer before bread hypothesis, and it is not a joke. The argument goes like this. Grain is annoying to turn into bread. It requires a lot of processing, grinding, and it's not even that nutritionally exciting compared to the meat and fruit early humans were already eating. So why would people give up the freedom of hunting and gathering, tie themselves to a single patch of land, and do the backbreaking work of farming, all for bland grain mush? Maybe the payoff wasn't food at all. Maybe the payoff was the beer. Consider Göbekli Tepe, a site in modern-day Turkey that's around 11,000 years old. It's one of the oldest monumental structures ever built, Massive carved stone pillars, arranged by people who supposedly didn't even have agriculture yet. And at this site, archaeologists found large stone vessels, some holding up to 40 gallons, with chemical traces suggesting they may have held fermented grain. In other words, before humans had cities, before we had writing, before we arguably even had farming in the full sense, we may have been gathering in huge numbers to build sacred monuments and brewing something to drink while we did it. Alcohol may not have been a byproduct of civilization. Alcohol may have been one of the reasons we built it. Let that sit for a second. The next time someone tells you drinking is a waste of time, you can inform them that it might be the entire reason your species stopped wandering and started building. Now why? Why would a drink be worth all of that? Why would something that literally impairs your judgment, slows your reflexes, and gives you a headache the next morning be so central to human development that we might have reorganized our entire way of life around it? The answer is one of the most human things there is. It brought people together. Think about what early human life was actually like. You lived in a small group. Trust was everything. If the group fractured, if people couldn't cooperate, everyone died. And building trust between people, especially between different groups who didn't know each other, is genuinely hard. It's risky. Now, alcohol does something very specific to the human brain. It lowers inhibition. It quiets the part of you that's constantly on guard, constantly calculating threats. And when a group of people lower their guard together, at the same time, in the same place, something powerful happens. They bond, they talk, they laugh. They reveal things about themselves. Anthropologists have argued that alcohol functioned as a kind of social technology, a tool that made it possible for large groups of humans to gather, relax, cooperate, and trust each other enough to build something bigger than a single family. A feast with a fermented drink wasn't just a party. It was diplomacy. It was how you sealed an alliance, celebrated a harvest, mourned a death, or convinced 100 strangers to work together on a project none of them could finish alone. The shared buzz was the glue, and once civilizations really got going, they didn't treat alcohol as a casual indulgence. They treated it as one of the most important things they had. Take ancient Sumer, one of the very first civilizations on Earth. They had a goddess specifically for beer. Her name was Ninkasi, and one of the oldest poems we have is essentially a hymn to her that also happens to be a working beer recipe. Think about that. Some of the earliest writing humans ever produced was instructions for how to brew. Not laws, not history, a recipe for beer, written as a prayer. In ancient Egypt, beer was so central that it functioned as actual currency. The workers who built the pyramids were paid, in part, in beer. Records suggest a daily ration of several liters per worker. The most impressive monuments in human history were, in a very real sense, powered by a workforce running on a steady supply of low-alcohol beer. Egyptian beer wasn't the crisp, clear stuff you're picturing either. It was thick, cloudy, almost like a bread soup, nutritious enough that it was genuinely part of the diet, safer to drink than a lot of the available water, and mildly intoxicating on top of all that. For much of human history, in fact, fermented drinks were safer than water because the fermentation process killed off many of the things in dirty water that could kill you. So for thousands of years, drinking a bit of alcohol every day wasn't reckless. It was one of the more sensible things you could do. Wine has a similar story on the other side of the fertility crescent, with evidence of winemaking going back at least 8,000 years in the region of modern Georgia, where people were fermenting grapes in giant clay vessels buried in the ground. Everywhere you look in the ancient world, the same thing keeps appearing. Different plants, different methods, different gods, but always the drink, always at the center of religion, economy, and daily survival. And once again, notice the pattern. It's the exact same story as fire, as smoke, as every other ancient human ritual. A group of people sitting together, altering their state together, becoming something more than the sum of their parts. That's not a bug in human history. That might be the core feature. But we have to be honest, because there's a darker thread running through all of this, and the channel wouldn't be doing its job if we skipped it. The same thing that helped us build civilization has also quietly haunted it the entire way. Because the very trait that made alcohol useful, the way it hijacks our reward system and makes us feel good, is also exactly what makes it dangerous. That 10 million-year-old wiring that helped our ancestors survive did not come with an off switch calibrated for a world where alcohol is cheap, strong, and available on every corner. Our ancestors encountered fermented fruit occasionally, in small amounts, by chance. Their bodies were built for a trickle. The modern world delivers a fire hose. And so the same instinct that once led a starving primate to life-saving calories now leads people into addiction, illness, and ruin. And here's a detail most people never think about. The hangover itself might be a feature, not a bug. That pounding head, the nausea, the regret, that is your 10 million-year-old body screaming at you that you overdid it, that you crossed a line your ancestors almost never had the opportunity to cross. In a world of occasional fermented fruit, you'd rarely be able to consume enough to truly poison yourself. The hangover was a rare alarm. In the modern world, it's a weekly one. The suffering is ancient wiring meeting modern abundance, a warning system built for a trickle, going off in a flood. Almost every ancient culture that discovered alcohol also, eventually, discovered its shadow. The oldest written laws we have, from ancient Mesopotamia, already include rules about taverns and drinking. The moment humans wrote anything down, we were already trying to manage our relationship with this stuff. That tells you everything. Alcohol has been both a gift and a problem for as long as we've had it. It sits in this strange, uncomfortable space, woven so deeply into who we are that we can't fully separate ourselves from it, and powerful enough that it has destroyed as much as it has built. A single molecule, doing both at once, for 10,000 years. So let's zoom all the way back out, because underneath the tree shrews and the stone vessels and the beer before bread debate, there's a bigger question hiding. Why? Why does this pull exist at all? Why do humans, and elephants, and birds, and bats, and bees all reach, in their own accidental ways, for the thing that alters their minds? One idea is that the drive to change how we feel, to escape the relentless default state of a survival-focused brain, even just for an afternoon, is not a flaw. It's a fundamental part of being a conscious creature. Being aware is exhausting. Being a prehistoric human, constantly scanning for danger, constantly hungry, constantly aware of your own mortality, was almost certainly worse. And here comes this fruit on the ground that, for 20 minutes, makes all of that go quiet. Of course we chased it. Of course we still do. The impulse to occasionally step outside of your own head might be as old as having a head worth stepping out of. What we know for sure is this: alcohol was not invented by humans. It was discovered, again and again, by accident, by creatures who had no idea what they were doing. It predates farming, it predates writing, it predates civilization, and it may have helped create all three. The specific drinks changed, the rituals changed, the reasons changed, but the behavior was already ancient by the time anyone thought to record it. And it all traces back to something almost impossibly simple: sugar, yeast, time. A piece of fruit falling from a tree and landing in the dirt, breaking open, and beginning quietly to transform into something that would go on to shape the entire human story. So the next time you're holding a drink, at a celebration, at a funeral, at the end of a long week, and you feel that familiar warmth spread through you and your shoulders finally drop, remember that you're not doing something new. You're not doing something modern. You're repeating a moment that stretches back through 10,000 years of human history and 10 million years of biology, all the way to a starving ancestor at the edge of a forest, reaching down for a piece of fallen fruit and feeling, for the very first time, and with absolutely no idea why, good.